Welcome everybody to the annual Yau Shing Yue lecture in Translation Studies, hosted by the Department of Translation at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and very kindly sponsored by Professor Yau Shing Tong, who has been able to join us today remotely from Beijing, where he is. He was formerly Professor of Mathematics at Harvard University, and now is the Director and Distinguished Visiting Professor at Large at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences here at Chinese University. Our speaker today is Peng Hsiao-yen, who, as I have just learned, is now retired from her position as research fellow at the Institute for Chinese Literature and Philosophy, Academia Sinica in Taiwan. She studied comparative literature at Harvard and wrote her thesis on Hsiao-yen. And since then, for several decades, she has gone on to publish numerous books and articles in 3 different languages, Chinese, French, and English, on a wide variety of topics in literary studies, Chinese studies, film, psychology and psychoanalysis, women's studies, and of course, translation studies. And I would like to just highlight 2 of Professor Peng's accomplishments that relate perhaps most directly to her talk today. First, in 2007 and 2008, when I was working at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom, Professor Peng and I collaborated on a research project sponsored jointly by Academia Sinica and the British Council, which resulted in the publication of a very fine collection of essays, China and its Others, Knowledge Transfer Through Translation, 1829 to 2010. And in 2010, Professor Peng also published Dandyism and Transcultural Modernity, the dandy, the flaneur, and the translator in 1980s Shanghai, Tokyo, and Paris. So without further ado, can I ask you all please to welcome Professor Peng? So over to you.
So, well, I will be talking more about transcultural studies than translation studies today. So, as a prominent research paradigm emerging in recent decades, transcultural studies is a reaction against comparative studies and post-colonial studies, trying to shun both one-on-one comparison and center margin confrontation models. Inheriting basic concepts from cultural studies, it emphasizes cultural hybridity and moves beyond the concepts of intercultural exchange and multiculturalism. Closely affiliated with translation studies, it is not mainly concerned with, however, with the rendering of one work or concept from one culture to another, or the life of one work in another culture. Rather, it concentrates on transcultural networks that highlight both uniformity with other cultures and one's own particular identity. The term transculturation was invented by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz in his 1940 book, Cuban Counterpoint, Tobacco and Sugar. He maintains that, in contrast to the popular concept of acculturation in anthropology, the idea of transculturation fits more the colonial experiences of Cuba. Acculturation refers to the transition from one culture to another, while transculturation emphasizes the extremely complex process of cultural implantation. If one fails to look at Cuba from the perspective of transculturation, one will not be able to understand the evolutionary process of the Cuban nation manifested in economy, social system, law, moral, religion, art, language, psychology, sexuality, and other aspects. For Ortiz, acculturation is unilateral, through which the dominant culture infiltrates and replaces a dominated culture. Transculturation, on the other hand, is bilateral. Neither the dominant nor the dominated can exclude itself from the process of transculturation. He believes that the real history of Cuba is a hybridized transcultural phenomenon. The Argentine and Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel has developed the theory of transculturation since the 1960s. His most significant publication is the 1992, The Invention of the Americas, Eclipse of the Other and the Myths of Modernity. Inheriting from Ortiz, the Latin American critical theory tradition, he demonstrates a strong sense of anti-Eurocentrism. Both believe that during the colonial operation, colonizer and colonized both experience the transcultural process or the process of creative transformation. Not only does the colonial experience reformulate the culture of the colony, but it redefines the self-knowledge of the colonizer. Another theorist worth mentioning is the Russian-American critic, Mikhail Epstein, who in a 1999 co-edited book titled Transcultural Experiments, Russian and American Models of Creative Communication, develops the idea of transculturation from Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of culturality. Epstein maintains that the transcultural approach takes issue with the traditional concept of national and cultural identity. It challenges identity politics and multiculturalism, defying the bondage of ideological and disciplinary traditions or the bondage of any prejudices. How do we define the meaning of transculturality? For me, its basic concepts concerns the relationship between self and other. The trans in transculturality denotes both to transcend and to transform, meaning to transcend and to transform the self through transculturation. It indicates that the process of the translation and infiltration of other languages and concepts, most often in a time of crisis, is the crucial key to self-renewal for a culture. Take, for instance, the concept of transgender, which refers to rising above the traditional gender boundary. In general, we can say that the main purpose of transculturality is to encourage thinking outside the silo, free from bondage of any boundaries or prejudices. In other words, all seemingly unsurmountable divides formed by nationalities, languages, geopolitics, disciplines, historical periodization, ideologies, gender differences, and so on should be overcome so that perspectives outside one silo can lead to new self-knowledge and that the creative transformation of the self is possible. In my study in 2010, I developed the concept of transcultural modernity. For me, modernity is possible only on the transcultural side. Transcultural in the sense of not only transnational and translingual, but also transterritorial, transhistorical, transdisciplinary, transgender, and so on. In my conceptualization, modernity does not refer to any specific historical period or any specific territory. In any time of any culture, whoever makes it their goal to pursue the new by breaking the traditional divide are those who are constantly on the threshold to engage in transcultural practice. They are the propellers of modernity. The transcultural site where cultures meet and overlap is where creative energy finds expression. Since antiquity, such creative energy has found a fecund space on the transcultural site for the self-transformation of a culture. In 2019, in another study, I proposed the concept of transcultural lexicon. The science and life view debate in 1923 has often been investigated as if it were an event specific to China alone. However, tracing how the German word Lebensanschauung, meaning life view, became the Japanese neologism Yunseikang, and then was widely used by the Chinese as 人生观 during the 1910s and 1920s, I managed to establish how the life view discourse connected China, Japan, France, and Germany at the turn of the 20th century as part of a global counter-enlightenment movement. Investigating how Bergson's creative evolution was translated into Japanese and Chinese, and how Rudolf Eucken was translated into Japanese and then introduced into China, I realized that life philosophy was the key to the counter-enlightenment movement at the time. Believing in intuition and the power of affect, the movement aimed to challenge enlightenment rationality. In China, this movement had already begun in the late Qing, when the Eastern-Western culture controversy was on the rise. In this study, I connect affect with the concept of qing in Confucianism that can be traced back to I Ching or the Book of Changes. It is also the concept of sentient beings, Yau Qing, in Buddhism, and the advocacy to follow nature and human impulses in Taoism. For Nishida Kidaro, the leader of the Kyoto Philosophy School, qing becomes zhou in Japanese, and he recognizes its connection with German Romanticism. My reading affiliating affect with qing is not far-fetched at all if we consider the popularity of Spinoza, Henri Bergson, and Rudolf Eucken during the life philosophy movement in both China and Japan, as well as in Europe. This global counter-enlightenment discourse had its origin in David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau during the European Enlightenment, and certainly preceded the counter-rationalism of the Frankfurt School in the 1960s, and the Deleuzian affect theory, not to mention the so-called affective turn in our own time. Going further than translation studies and keyword research, the study of transcultural lexicon emphasizes that the introduction of a transcultural term into a culture often indicates its connection to a global event. No culture in history is ever completely isolated from the rest of the world. Globalization seems to be a recent concept, but it was and has always been a fact in global history, if only we re-examine world history from transcultural perspectives. In 2014, at a workshop on transcultural theory at Academia Sinica, I proposed the concept of connectivity and subjectivity in flux, highlighting that subjectivity is constantly changing and becoming in the process of transculturation. But when I give lectures on the topic, especially in mainland China, students often worry that the idea suggests a lost subjectivity in the transcultural process. To tackle this problem, in recent years, I've been ruminating on the concept of a transcultural paradox. The idea of paradox comes from Mo Zhongsan's 1987 Hong Kong lectures on Zhuangzi's 齐物论, or on the quality of things. Mo points out that in 齐物论, Zhuangzi says, quote, "When I say you are dreaming, I myself am also dreaming. This kind of statement is called 吊诡, unquote." Mo then comments, quote, "The term 吊诡, although a concept specific to Zhuangzi, is still applicable today. We can use the term to translate paradox," unquote. But for Mo, there is a significant distinction between 吊诡 and paradox. The Hegelian dialectic follows logic and analysis. It is a linear logical thinking or speculative thinking. Zhuangzi's 吊诡, on the other hand, follows intuition. It is a curvaceous wisdom. Mo maintains that following intuition, Zhuangzi is able to resolve the dichotomy of being and non-being, or harmonize two polar opposites, and thereby reach the absolute. For him, in contrast to logical and speculative thinking, the Taoist dialectical paradox is practical. It belongs to the realm of personal practice. Does this suggest an affinity to Foucault's concept of freedom of practice? This topic is worth further investigation in the future. What is paradox then? I doubt if the transculturation process can ever harmonize two polar opposites and thereby reach the absolute. The so-called absolute indicates that there is an absolute truth. According to Mo Zhongsan, quote, "Between heaven and earth, only morality and religion is the absolute truth," unquote. And truth is universal. But in view of the endless global conflicts over morality and religion, we know that truth in this regard is relative rather than absolute. On the other hand, the need for transculturality is indeed a universal truth because all cultures have to mix with others so that new ideas can stimulate regeneration and ensure cultural survival and prosperity. We forget more than we can remember. Without external stimulation, there would be no new ideas to rejuvenate what is left of our tradition. Self-isolation, therefore, inevitably leads to the decline of a culture, as indicated by the famous Easter Island study in anthropology. While mixing with other cultures is a norm, all cultures go through the process of the paradox of transculturality, in which two or more opposing cultures coexist but can never be truly harmonized. When cultures meet, misunderstandings and conflicts often begin. At the outset of the encounter, there may be curiosity or even marvel for the unfamiliar. But when the infiltrating culture is caught in domestic conflicts of interest, xenophobia begins. My recent investigation finds that in the prolonged operations of cultural hybridization and transculturation, self and other coexist in a perpetual paradox. In harmony, the foreign in one's own culture is never questioned. In dire cacophony, however, it can become sources of severe conflicts. In the following, I concentrate on the concept of transcultural paradox, which argues for the precarious coexistence of self and other. What I call the foreign refers to elements remote in time as well as in space. Let us see the fickle fate of a foreign religion transported through the Silk Road into China, approximately between the Western Han and the Eastern Han dynasties, or at the turn of the Christian era. Buddhism, first introduced at the heyday of Taoism, did not have a chance to thrive. Confucianism mixed with Taoism became the dominant ideology to consolidate the reign of Emperor Wu of Han before the Christian era. From the year 304 to 439, the 5 foreign ethnic rulers that had infiltrated China from the north began to promote Buddhism to support their sovereignty. Then, during the Eastern Han, repeated natural disasters such as floods, droughts, pests, earthquakes, and pestilences paved the way for Buddhism to prosper. During the Sui and Tang dynasties, it reached the peak of its career in China. The so-called the unity of the three teachings, a concept we are all familiar with, began during the Ming from the 14th to 17th centuries. However, in the prolonged transculturation process that lasted more than a millennium, Buddhism had suffered severe persecutions before it was finally on a par with the other 2 teachings as integral parts of Chinese culture. We can examine the 3 horrific events in history called San Wu Mian Fo, or the exterminations of Buddhism by the 3 emperors Wu. The 3 emperors Wu referred to Tai Wu Di of the Northern Wei dynasty in the 5th century, Wu Di of the Northern Zhou dynasty in the 6th century, and Wu Zong of the Tang in the 9th century. These events lasted from 5 to 6 years respectively. They massively destructed Buddhist temples and Buddha statues, burned sutras, confiscated Buddhist lands and properties, secularized or even executed monks, murdered political players caught in the religious conflicts between Taoism and Buddhism, or between native Han and foreign powers. These 3 disastrous events were certainly not alone in the complex transculturation process of Buddhism in China. How Taoism and Buddhism were caught in political struggles can be best illustrated by the reign of Empress Wu Zetian in the 7th century. During her reign, first as consort and then as empress, Confucianism mixed with Taoism as the state orthodoxy for 8 centuries was eventually replaced by Buddhism. Raised as a devout Buddhism by her mother, as a devout Buddhist by her mother, the empress was fully aware of the popular devotion to Buddhism and the dissatisfaction of the Buddhist community with the pro-Taoism policy of the court since the inauguration of the Tang. Aided by these prevailing folk sentiments, she set out to have a miracle stone forged on which is inscribed the oracle about the coming of a holy mother who would rule the country in the name of Buddha. In the year 6090, she declared herself empress and began the policy of prioritizing Buddhism over Taoism. To consolidate her rule, she continued to sway public opinion with fake information, including a false translation of a Buddhist sutra in 693, in which it is written that Buddha lectured about his incarnation as a woman ruler who taught the people with Buddhist teachings, constructed temples and pagodas, and provided for those who practiced Buddhism. Supported by this fake sutra, she befriended monks, lavishing expensive gifts on them, and had numerous temples built. The Buddha statues in the newly built temples combined male solemnity and female grace, looking exactly like herself. She also organized the translation of Avantamsaka Sutra, Huayan Jing, 80 volumes in total, and wrote a preface to it. In addition, she improved and finalized the power structure of the Buddhist clergy to facilitate its management and stability. Not only did the fate of Buddhism in China illustrate the entanglement between religion and politics, but it embodied the paradox of transculturality. When deemed advantageous for a political position, a foreign religion is promoted and celebrated until it becomes an inseparable part of one's own culture. When conflicts of interest arise, it is completely denounced, and its practicing members and supporters can be decimated. In the transculturation process, the coexistence of foreign cultures with domestic ones is always liable to drastic changes. Unforeseeable developments are always on the cards. Buddhism, gradually growing into an integral part of Chinese culture after its introduction in antiquity, has been suffering transformation again since the establishment of New China. Looking at its past history in Chinese soil, one should not be surprised at all at its current fate and development there. Another example I will discuss in the following is the fate of Confucianism in modern times. During the late Qing and May 4th period, Confucianism was denounced by people advocating Western science as the culprit for China's backwardness. For people in opposition, however, it was touted together with Buddhism and Taoism as the essence of Eastern culture. These three teachings played a significant role during the Eastern-Western culture controversy, as I mentioned earlier in this talk. Most mainstream scholars believe that the May 4th spirit is best symbolized by the Down with Confucianism slogan, a slogan that the Chinese Communist Party had turned into state policy for decades. Yet, after the Deng Xiaoping open door policy starting in 1979 became a success story that has pushed China onto the world political economic platform, the CCP has completely reversed its attitude toward Confucianism. Eager for a soft power that represents Chinese culture, numerous Confucius institutes have been established on university campuses all over the globe. For academics who always have a keen eye for state policy, the necessity for new research topics has become a pressing issue. How can one resolve the paradoxical coexistence of New Confucianism, Maoism, and Deng Xiaoping's theory of state capitalism? In 2004, the new leftist Gan Yang, with a view to, quote, raising awareness of the subjectivity of Chinese civilization, unquote, proposed in a lecture the concept of Tong San Tong in the contemporary era. Tong San Tong means unifying the three traditions. This text was later collected with commentaries and rebuttals from other leading intellectuals in a thin volume in 2007. In the Confucian tradition, Tong San Tong originally refers to unifying the cultural, political, and historical identities of China as a civilized community, embodying diverse customs and politics. For Gan Yang, contemporary China needs a new version of Tong San Tong to resolve the diversity of ideologies it faces in a global world.
Central to Ganyang's theory is that China's economic boom in recent decades can only be explained by Chinese rather than Western logic. And neither Russia nor India has been able to parallel China's success. Two problematic issues stand out in his investigation. First, how Mao Zedong's decentralized economy paved the way for Deng's open door policy. And second, how the centripetal force of traditional Chinese culture played a key role in China's economic reform. In the first 15 years of Mao's rule, the Russian way of state-planned economy served as a model, but did not prevail. Gorbachev's economic reform failed because his centralized state policy was led by a small group of experts and state officials. When the state-controlled enterprises eventually flopped, the whole economy crashed. After the failure of the first 15 years based on Russia's centralized approach, Mao then adopted the decentralization policy, which was modeled on the Yan'an experience of mass movement. By the time the open door policy began, all local governments had been fully prepared for taking on the economic reform initiative. We therefore should not denounce Mao's rule as totally negative and separate categorically from Deng's years, according to Ganyang. Another factor that contributed to Deng's success was the voluminous investment streams coming from overseas Chinese in the 1980s and 1990s. The attachment to one's ancestral home, a sentiment deeply rooted in Chinese culture, does not seem to work in the same way for the economic development of other countries like India, Russia, and Israel. Ganyang's conclusion is that the greatest challenge of the 21st century is to renew our understanding of China and to recognize the historical continuity of Confucianism, Maoism, and Deng's state capitalism. In the meantime, it is also of paramount importance to really understand the West so that China would learn about its own uniqueness, says Ganyang. So Confucianism, completely denounced as a feudal remnant in mainland China after the May Force, is now becoming the new state orthodoxy. In the name of the renaissance of Chinese culture and reconstructing a harmonious society, numerous media programs and print materials on Confucianism have been circulating in recent decades. This discussion topics on Confucianism abound, like the modern meaning of Confucianism, Confucian culture and national renaissance, the Chinese dream and contemporary Confucianism, and so on and so forth. May Force critics such as Chen Pingyuan, who were used to discrediting Confucianism, have found themselves in an embarrassing situation. In 2019, at the 100th anniversary of the May Force movement, Chen decided not to commemorate the event at a large scale at Beidang. As we know so well, May Force studies has nearly become taboo in mainland China for fear of student insurrections. Scholars in philosophy, such as Huang Yushun, however, has found it an opportunity to revive traditional studies by proposing the concept of 生活者的儒学, which means life Confucianism or Confucianism in everyday life. To me, its connection with the May Force Life View School life philosophy and counter-enlightenment movement is more than clear, although Huang himself never recognizes that. One of his books, published in 2006, was translated into English in 2017, titled Life, Confucianism as a New Philosophy, Love and Thought. The vicissitudes of the fate of Confucianism in China is a promising topic for anyone interested in transcultural studies. Its entanglements with Buddhism, Taoism, and political maneuverings over the centuries fully illustrate the phenomenon of transcultural paradox, a concept that I have been working on and inviting those concerned to consider. To conclude my talk today, I would like to emphasize that transculturality entails an ethical attitude towards others. There are 5 points I would like to make about transcultural studies. First, critiquing the fixed self. Transculturation theory investigates the relationship between self and other, maintaining that because of the constant mixing with others, subjectivity is going through a process of ceaseless transformation, becoming, and renewal. Bakhtin's concept of the self on the threshold, Fabian Heubel's énergie soufflée, which means gasified energy, or my idea of subjectivity in flux, are all synonymous with concept of fluid identities in globalization theory. These concepts all aim to critique the idea of self that is fixed and unchanging. As Foucault maintains, the formation of subjectivity is a process of ceaseless desubjectification and subjectification. It is an unending dialectic. Adorno, on the other hand, maintains that subjectivity is formed by the perpetual tension between unification and deunification. Subjectivity is always fluid and changeable. In contrast to the concept of multiple selves, transcultural studies emphasizes the self in flux and the possibility for creative self-transformation. Second, maintaining that culture is hybrid. In world history, modernity has often been triggered by colonial or semi-colonial experiences because the cultural hybridization brought about by colonization provides a hotbed for modernity to breed. When Fabian Heubel criticized contemporary European philosophy for inward-looking and xenophobia, he maintained the concept of cultural hybridity. When I studied the neo-sensation school in Shanghai, Tokyo, and Paris, I proposed the concept of the macaronic to emphasize the hybrid nature of languages and cultures. Joyce Liu, on the other hand, uses the concept of syncretism to discuss the key to transformation in modern Chinese thought. While Enlightenment rationality views the subject as the center of the objective world, and thus leads to the dichotomy of subject and object. In translation studies, we see Lydia Liu divides between host language and guest language. By contrast, transcultural studies is concerned with the complex coexistence of subject and object. The mutual infiltrations of self and others are so intertwined and fine-spun that it is nearly impossible to distinguish host from guest, subject from object.
From the perspective of transcultural studies, modern Chinese literature and philosophy provide infinite potential for innovative theoretical contribution, exactly because of the hybridization process of their formation embedded in centuries of East-West encounters. Third, rejecting authenticity and centrism. About national and personal identity, transcultural studies maintains that in the globalization process that has contracted geological distances and blurred cultural differences, national borders no longer confine our sense of identity and ways of life. The so-called pure nation or pure culture is suspect. Culture is by nature hybridized. Interior hybridization is no less complex than exterior hybridization. On a personal level, under the onslaught of globalization, the cultural formation of an individual is also hybridized and combining heterogeneous elements. In other words, personality is also transcultural. To wit, transcultural studies challenges the concept of any form of centrism, such as Eurocentrism, Americentrism, Sinocentrism, or even Taiwan centrism. The concept of authenticity is also put into question. The so-called pure Chinese or authentic Chinese is doubtful. Fourth, dialoguing with comparative studies and post-colonial studies. Comparative studies aims to compare the similarities of and differences between individual cultures, philosophies, or literatures, but often fails to respond to the dynamic, complex phenomena of cultural hybridity in a global world. Transcultural studies, on the other hand, is more concerned with the receptibility of a culture and its potential to transform and renew itself due to the infiltrations of heterogeneous elements. Not only does the dominant culture transform the dominated, but it can also be transformed by the dominated. Post-colonial studies highlights peripheral resistance against central hegemony and the relationship between knowledge and power. By contrast, transcultural studies maintains that the inequality of power relations is a constant. The issue is how the dominated finds agency to act in the tightly controlled power structures of the dominating class. Just as Homi Bhabha points out, agency always exerts itself in an unequal relationship. While post-colonial studies criticizes the colonial past and the inequality at present, transcultural studies, with past and present in view, faces the possible future created by the dominated. Fifth, transcultural connectivity and an ethical attitude toward others. Globalization theory advocates personal and organizational efforts to redress the rich-poor dichotomy and ecological problems. Similarly, transcultural theory also involves an ethical attitude towards others in the midst of transcultural connectivity. I maintain that not only does transcultural ethics call for a respect for others, but it entails a recognition of the numerous others that are already inseparable parts of ourselves. As a contrast to the concept of multiple selves, transcultural studies emphasizes the possibility of creative self-transformation as a result of the hybrid coexistence of self with countless others.
critiquing fixed subjectivity, authenticity, and centrism, and proposing subjectivity in flux and cultural hybridity, transcultural studies aims at an ethical attitude towards others. Here, I would like to quote a simple poem written by John Donne in the 17th century to illustrate my seemingly complex thesis here. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the man. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for me. In this time of pandemic, this poem has always been on my mind. I thank you for your attention. Any comment or question you may have is most welcome. Thank you very much. Back to you, James. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that talk. Very rich and thoughtful as always. You've got me thinking in several different directions. But can I ask first whether we have questions from the audience? If you want to ask a question, you'll need to unmute yourself and signal. No?
Hi, excuse me. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, what is the difference between transcultural and transnational? Because there's a concept of transnationalism proposed by Stephen Viktovic, a German sociologist. So I was just wondering, as I heard the concept, a new concept of transcultural, I was wondering the connection and the differences between these two. Thank you.
All right, shall I answer the question now?
Sure.
Okay. Well, there are certainly differences between these two concepts. For transnational, it means between different nations, among different nations. But for transcultural, it's between cultures or among cultures. As we know, in the nation, there are, most often several cultures coexisting. So if you say transnational, for instance, in China, if you say that, then it would mean, between China or Japan, or between China and America. But if you say transcultural, it could be the relationships between Buddhism, Taoism, and there are several cultural traditions in China alone. It's the same in any country. Culture and nation do not always coincide with each other. They do not equal each other. I wonder if I've answered your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Other questions from the floor? Well, maybe while we're waiting, I'll ask one myself. So I was struck when you were talking about affect and you're linking affect, the word affect in English with the word qing in
Yes.
Chinese. This was in the pre-pandemic age, I attended a conference in Venice where there was a very interesting paper on the relationship between affect and translation. So I'm wondering, while you were thinking about the relationship between affect and qing, did you think about the question of the translation of affect as opposed to the translation of text when we sort of concentrate on thinking about, oh, what does the text mean and how do we say that in another language? If you're talking about the translation of affect, then it's the question of how does the text affect the reader and how do we convey that affect in our translation.
Okay. Affect is usually translated as 行动力 in Chinese. In my study, I find there are affinities between them. 情 in Chinese, is more than feeling. It's the same way with affect. Affect is also more than feeling.
Yes.
For Spinoza, affect is the power that defines a body. Okay, so it is the affective power of a body. All right, so different entities can affect each other. This body doesn't necessarily mean a human body or an animal body. It can be a body of water, a body of gas. It can be any plants or any rocks. So affect, in addition to being emotion, is also the power relations between different entities or between different bodies. And qing in Chinese is also, it also has this ontological aspect. For the Chinese, qing, in Confucianism, it can be traced back to I Ching. Qing refers to everything that is living. Okay, like in Buddhism, Yau Qing refers to sentient beings. And in Chinese, qing refers to anything, any living being or any non-living being. It can be a plant or a rock. So there is interaction between humans and non-humans, between heaven and earth. So qing is the relational power that is holding the whole universe together. Okay, so that's for the Book of Changes or the Confucian tradition. So for both affect and qing, you have this basic concept of emotion or feeling, and then this ontological aspect of heaven, of the connection between heaven and earth, between human beings, between humans and non-humans, between beings and non-beings. I'm making the connection based on these ideas. So in my book, actually, right now I'm writing, in English about the connection between affect and qing. I am hoping that in addition to explaining what qing means, I would be able to help readers understand better what affect refers to. It is not just emotion in psychology. It is this ontological aspect that is more worth our attention.
That sounds fascinating. So that's a paper that you're preparing or a book?
Which quote, excuse me?
No, I said, is it are you writing an article or are you writing a book on this?
A book.
Oh.
Yeah, actually, in 2019, I published a volume on the dialectic between reason and affect. That was in Chinese, okay? But now I'm trying to write an English version on the topic.
That sounds really interesting. I'll have to look that up.
But it's rather difficult. Even though it's an English version, it's not translation. I have to rewrite the whole thing. Mm-hmm.
So other comments or questions from the audience?
Nice talks.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I have another question actually, or really sort of amusing. When you were talking about transculturalism, it sounded to me very Taoist.
Oh.
So the emphasis
really?
on the self as constantly in transformation sounds very much like passages from Zhuangzi that I read
Yes.
when I was studying at Taidao
Yeah.
many years ago. So I wonder, have you thought about the relationship between Taoism and the notion of transculturalism?
Of course, it's part of, you know, the idea of the Mayforce concept of Taoism has been part of my inspiration when I am working on the topic. You see, actually the concept of change became very popular after Bergson and Eucken were introduced into China, because both emphasized that change is actually the most important concept about nature or human nature. Evolution refers to change, right? Change of the evolution of the living beings, or evolution of the so change struck quite a few Chinese as the main doctrine of Bergsonism. And of course, for them, Taoism came to their mind, and also Confucianism. They use the concept of 日日新 to understand what Bergson means by change, and they understand it as improvement. Okay, to change, there is no fixed self. Okay, for Liang Qichao, the Confucian concept of 物义物故无我. There's no fixed self, no permanent self. So they naturally connected the concept of evolution with Taoism and Confucianism. So what I've been thinking now, of course, have been inspired by these discussions during the Mayforce.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can see the connections.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, who's that? Is that Michelle?
It's Michelle from Translation CHK. Professor Peng, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I learned a lot from what you share. I have two small questions. I I am deeply impressed by your idea that modernity should not be simplified as a period or the phenomenon of any location. That modernity is any attempt to break traditions and go for the new and go transcultural. I'm deeply impressed by this view. I'm wondering, given such thoughts, how useful are such concepts as post-modernity and high modernity that bind us to necessary periodization? Are these terms out of date? Are they still useful? That would be my first question. My second question would be, we've learned a lot about the macro changes across history, the entanglement of religion and politics, and how different streams of thought are unified. The temperament of a generation such as May 4th, those are big pictures. But how do we apply the concept of transculturality into our observations of ourselves, of our experience as individuals? I really look forward to listening to your views on these. Thank you. That would be my question.
Okay, thank you. Those were very good questions. Whether the traditional concept of modernity or high modernity are outdated, I think it depends on the context. If you want to talk about a specific period of time, you can always use the term. So the meaning will be clear. Yeah. If you're talking about period, I think people would understand easily. But my concept of modernity is actually more theoretical. It's not bound by a certain period of time or, East-West. For me, all people, are able to engage in activities of propelling modernity. For my concept, modernity is not exclusive to the Western world. So in any society, in any culture, people who are striving to change the self, to recreate the self, and to find new horizons for creativity, I think are engaging in activities of modernity. So it's my theoretical approach. But I do not denounce the periodization concept because it's convenient when you want to talk about, for instance, James Joyce or Virginia Woolf. You can always talk about the period of modernity in England. About how to apply the concept of transculturality to ourselves as individuals. Yeah, that I have often been asked that question, and I have been trying to answer that question, but I haven't been very successful. But I think the most important idea is that when you have the transcultural consciousness, your life becomes full of choices. You don't have to be confined by your own traditions. You don't have to feel that you are imitating others when you adopt something foreign. So it actually points to the many choices that are open to you. So transculturality, when applied to an individual, points to the multiple choices that are possible for this person to choose from. You in your daily life, you can when you meet with different peoples, you can use different languages to communicate with them. That is part of the transcultural elements that you can draw from. So for people who are interested in transcultural studies, the priority is to learn as many languages that you can. Nowadays, if you want to study modern Chinese literature, just knowing Chinese and English is not enough. I think you have to at least know Japanese in order to understand how China becomes China today. So if you want to apply the concept of transculturality to yourself, you have to open up yourself. You make yourself open to different languages, different cultures, so that your life would be more interesting, and so that you can understand other people better, and so that you can, to tell the truth, understand yourself better. Well, I don't know if I have answered your question. That's my thought for the moment. Well,
thank you very much. I think the term transcultural consciousness perfectly describes our status quo as translators and a global citizen. Thank you very much. It fills me with hope.
Thank you.
There's a question that somebody typed in the chat box on the side. I'll read it out in case you can't see it. So somebody asked, does the hybridity of the individual concerning others have anything to do with collectivism?
Collectivism.
Yes.
Well, the concept of hybridity, of course, is related to collectivism, but I think it denotes more the differences between the different elements that are combined together. When you say collectivism, it sounds like people are thinking uniformly. You have a uniform concept. Everybody thinks the same way. They act the same way. They are pursuing the same goal. But when you're talking about hybridity, of course, you see multiple collectivisms in hybridity. But at the same time, you see differences when these multiple collectivisms are combined together. I don't know if I'm clear enough. So hybridity emphasizes more individual elements, but collectivism emphasizes collectivity, right? So the major difference is there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that makes sense to me. I'm not sure about the person who asked the question.
I hope so.
Anybody else?
I have a couple of questions.
Oh, Mylan.
Hi. So you mentioned the differences between post-colonial studies and transcultural studies. I'm sure you've been asked these many times as well, but I would like to know how does transcultural studies reflect on power differences? That's my first question. My second question is about the self being an identity in flux, which makes me think of Stuart Hall, obviously. And I'm also thinking that gender studies and the notion of intersectionality, more precisely, have suggested that the self is complex and that we should take into account various categories, the most obvious ones being like social class, gender, race, and so on. So how do these reflections fit with transcultural studies, or maybe they don't, because perhaps you're interested in the historical dimension and in change and so on. But can you tell us or tell me about that a little bit? Thank you.
Okay, there seem to be two questions, right? One is the relationship between post-colonial studies and transcultural studies.
Yes.
Yeah.
power differences in transcultural studies.
Power difference.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, I will start with this question first. Okay. All right. For post-colonial studies, the concentration is on the dichotomy between the dominator and the dominated, or hegemony and marginal. So it's a dichotomy between power and knowledge, so on and so forth. But for transcultural studies, the dichotomy is not as important as how the dominated manages to find a breakthrough in the power structure dominated by the dominating class. All right, so I would say the concentration is on the agency to act of the dominated, rather than the conflicting situation between the conflicting power relations between the dominator and the dominated. All right, so that's the basic difference I would like to mention. So for transcultural studies, the view is for the future, because when you emphasize what the dominated can do, then you are looking toward the future that is possibly created by the dominated. But for post-colonial studies, they criticize the colonial past. They lament the unequal power relations at present, and they don't seem to ever talk about the future. But for transcultural studies, I would say it's more, would you say more positive or less depressing? So it's there's an ethical aspect to that. I mean, transcultural studies believes in the agency of the actors. Okay. So the other question is about identity, about subjectivity in flux. Yes. Okay, so your question is how it is related to gender identity? Okay. So I think, yes. I think the relationship is quite clear to me. I mean, at the present time, when we talk about gender fluidity or gender identities, the concept is constantly changing, right? You can be male, you can be female, you can be both male, female. There's no traditional divides between the sexes, or sexes maybe not between the genders, right? So so it's a concept that is freeing, right? It's encouraging people to transcend the gender boundaries. And so for transculturality, for the self in flux, the idea is the same. And because to tell the truth, our concept changes constantly, right? Or if you, I mean, for a child, if you ask him or her, what do you want to be in the future? When he is 6, he may be saying, I want to be a mommy, or I want to be a daddy. And when he's 10, he may say, I want to be a teacher. And when he's 15, he may say, I want to run for president. So our thought is constantly changing, and our identity is constantly changing as well. Each of us has different identities, right? We combine them and they can, work together peacefully, or they can be in conflict with each other. We are mothers, we are fathers, we are teachers, we are citizens, and we are working mothers, and my work may be in conflict with my role as a mother. So we embody, everybody embodies different roles. And throughout our lifetime, we have different role models out there, right? It's the same for cultures. In a historical period, maybe Buddhism became the dominant culture in China. Or in another period, Confucianism was on the rise. And, as I said in my talk, Confucianism has gone through a strange journey in China as well, right? So, so about subjectivity in flux or fluid identities, I think all these concepts are, related to each other.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Hsiao-yen, there's another question somebody asked in the chat room. So I'll again read that out. So this is from Zhang Yinjie, who says, I'd like to ask a question about the theoretical foundation of transcultural studies.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Ortz's concept of transculturation.
Mm-hmm.
So she asks, is transcultural studies based on Ortz's concept of transculturation, or is it also related to Wolfgang Welsch's concept of transculturality in any way?
The question I didn't quite get. Is it based on transculturality or?
So she's saying that you had mentioned Ortz and Ortz's concept of transculturation.
Yeah.
And they were wondering if Wolfgang Welsch's concept of transculturality is also something that you're drawing on in your discussion of transculturality.
Oh yes, I read his work as well. Yes, of course. It's about the in the beginning when I was talking about in my opening comments when I talk about transculturality highlights both uniformity with other cultures and one's own particular identity. Yes, that comes from Welsh. Yeah, very observant. Yes.
So are there any other questions? It's almost 7 o'clock here, so we've been grilling you for quite a while, actually.
It was a pleasure.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat room. So if not, then I'd like to say thank you very much.
Thank you.
A pleasure as always to listen to your work, and I hope to see more of your writing published in the near future. And thank you again. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And just Hsiao-yen, just a note, Mylan, the woman who just asked you those questions, was involved with a project that I did. We had a conference here a few years ago, and she wrote a paper on the portrayal of Chinese literature in Spain. How Chinese literature is presented in Spanish, in translation in Spanish.
Okay.
Both the translations, but also the paratextual elements, things like the book covers and things like that. So
I'm the translator of Shen Wen into Spanish also.
Oh,
yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful.
I'm a student of Isabelle Rabu. Maybe you know her from Paris.
Oh, yeah. Isabelle, yes. And her husband,
Angel Pinot.
Yeah, Pinot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I worked with them a long time ago, but yeah, and then I was.
Oh, you worked in France as well with them?
And then I was in Hong Kong in Baptist, and I worked with James in that book. So yeah.
Oh, I see.
But we also have Shen Wen in common. That's what I wanted to say.
Oh yes, yes,
Yes.
yes. Do you know how Isabelle Rabu is doing now in Paris? How is she doing?
I haven't talked to her for a while, but last time I spoke to her, she was doing fine. Yeah, she's still translating and writing and teaching.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure Angèle is fine as well. Yeah. Angèle worked on Beijing, and we had a conference in Bordeaux. Yeah, that's great.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. So we have common friends.
Yes.
Okay.
One of the nice things about Zoom is, so Mylon is actually in France now. Able to attend your lecture because we're doing it virtually. It's nice that different people can come in and participate.
Oh yes, yes, certainly. It works well, much better than I had thought. So thank you for the arrangement.
Yes.